Good evening, and welcome to the Church of the Redeemer. We're really being Episcopalian sort of strung out to the room, so if you want to come closer, those of you who want to be able to escape, I understand why you want to be, but come on up closer. It's nice to be in your presence. So welcome, as you all have heard me say, but I want to say again, the Redeemer Speaker Series Voices seeks to serve the broad community of Baltimore by inviting contemporary voices to challenge and inform us. We've had artists and authors, we've had visionaries, we've had thought leaders, we've had advocates of change that are courageous enough to hold the loveliness and the sorrow of the world at once, and find the wonder in both. Shane Claiborne is a speaker, activist, and a best-selling author. Shane worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta and founded The Simple Way in Philadelphia. He heads up Red Letter Christians, a movement of folks who are committed to living, quote, as if Jesus meant the things he said. I like that. Shane is a champion for grace, which has led him to jail, advocating for the homeless, and to places like Iraq and Afghanistan to stand against war. Now grace fuels his passion to end the death penalty and to help stop gun violence. Shane has written a lot of books, and he's brought several different ones, which is great, out there for you to purchase, I hope. And he's been featured in a number of films, including Another World is Possible and Ordinary Radicals. So it's my pleasure to present to you Shane Claiborne.
Thanks so much. I know there's a lot of choices you could make on what to do on a Wednesday night, and I'm glad you chose to be here. And it wasn't too far of a trip for me down from Philly. That's where I've called North Philadelphia my home for the last 25 or so years. But as you can tell, I grew up in the hills of Tennessee. In fact, I just found out, my uncle told me there's a moonshine show apparently. We don't really watch much TV, but there's a moonshine show, and my cousins apparently are the moonshiners. So there you go. Those are my people, yeah. But I fell in love with Jesus in East Tennessee in the Bible Belt, and I've been figuring it out ever since. I also feel like that world began to shape so much of who I am, my politics, my worldview, and I grew up saying that I was pro-life. But I began to see how narrowly we defined what that was, right? And for me, the new book I've written is called Rethinking Life, because I saw the irony that you can be pro-guns, pro-death penalty, pro-war, and still say you're pro-life as long as you are against abortion. And I wanted to be more robust in my own ethic of life. And so as I kind of leaned into that, rather than rejecting that, I kind of wanted to expand it, and that's where Mother Teresa became really instrumental for me, because she was so consistent and comprehensive in her advocacy for life. She's often known for her passion on abortion, but she also was very passionate about the death penalty. She called governors the night before executions and said, "Do what Jesus would have you do." And in some cases was able to be a voice to stop execution. She got in the middle of wars. She took her sisters and they interrupted bombings and violence. And so I was so intrigued by that, as I really was pursuing my own faith and what it looks like to try to live as if Jesus meant the stuff he said. I was intrigued by Mother Teresa. And so we were 18 years old, and no one had convinced us anything was impossible. So we wrote her a letter and didn't hear back, but that didn't stop us. We just started calling nuns and asking to get a hold of Mother Teresa, and she finally picked up the phone when we called India from a payphone in our dorm. And I went to India and spent a summer there, and there's so many things that shaped me, but one of them was this young man that was, I don't know, maybe 25 years old. He was just a little older than me, and he said, "You know why we call her Mother?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Tell me." And he said, "Because she's our mom." And he said, many of us, we were orphans. Some of us were abandoned in train stations or on the street, and she began to take us in. And he said, and that's how she became known as Mother Teresa. She was like that woman in the shoe who had so many kids she didn't know what to do. And he said, "She's my mom, though." And he started showing me things that she had given him over the years. So when I was in India, everyone just called her Mother. And that work of advocating for life, I saw it, every moment of our days in India. My job in India, one of the things I did every day was work in the home for the destitute and dying. It was Mother Teresa's first home that she started, and where they would rescue folks off the street and bring them in, and it was a holy place, right? Because if people got better, then they went to the home for the sick. But this is the home for the dying. So it was people's, really their last season of their life, where their last few days. So often we were the last eyes that they were looking into. So that's why Mother Teresa was passionate about joy and smiling. And, we would massage their muscles, and we would sing together and laugh and tell jokes. And it sounds a little somber, home for the dying. But when you go into the morgue, where the bodies would go when someone had passed away, on the wall it says, "I'm on my way to heaven." And when you turn around, on the other side of the wall it says, "Thanks for helping me get here." And my friend said, it kind of feels like we're travel agents. We're like trying to help folks get from this world to the next, to make that transition. And that, that value for life, the sense that, Mother Teresa used to say that when she would scold people if they didn't put enough gravy or dal on the rice, right? Because she would say, you need to feed this person like you are feeding Jesus, because you are, right? That she really believed that, as Christ said, when I was hungry, did you give me something to eat? That there is something sacramental and holy that we're doing as we take care of those. And that's why she said, in the poor we can see Jesus in his most distressing disguises. And so, that shaped me. And then, as I came back to Philadelphia, we started a lot of that same work, rescuing folks that were addicted or in domestic violence, or, trying to just come alongside folks wherever they are. And one of the many things that our neighborhood is recovering from, healing from, is the loss of, I think, the sacredness of life, especially when it comes to gun violence, right? Our neighborhood bears the brunt of so much of the gun violence in our city. Last year, our city lost over 500 lives to gun homicides. It's the most that we've ever had in the history of Philadelphia. As you may know, our country hit the record number of gun deaths that it's had in modern history. Over 40,000 lives lost during the pandemic in 1 year from gun violence. And it became the number one cause of death of children in America. And that's why I often say, we can't say that we're pro-life and ignore gun violence, right? To think about what it's going to look like to try to save lives when it comes to guns. And the reason I wrote a book about gun violence is because I found that not only are Christians not always the champions on the issue of gun violence, but we're sometimes the problem, right? In fact, the highest gun-owning demographic in America is evangelical Christians. We own guns at a higher rate than the general population. And there's so many, I think that the gun and the cross give us two very different versions of power, right? One of them says, I'm willing to die, and the other one says, I'm willing to kill. And it became impossible for me to reconcile loving my enemy with simultaneously preparing to kill them. So I had all this going on inside of my own soul. But then living in the north side of Philadelphia, I began to realize that proximity makes all the difference in the world. And there's that old saying that says, where we sit determines what we see. And I think, where we live shapes the urgency of what's a priority. I'm convinced that in the church, one of our deepest challenges is not just a compassion problem, but a proximity problem. That there's sometimes this social and geographical distance from the pain. In fact, my friend Derek Webb, who's a wonderful singer and songwriter, he names this so well. He has a song that one of the lines is essentially, God's been good. I've finally been able to move out of Jesus' neighborhood. And he kind of names the fact that the whole story of Jesus is about God leaving the comfort of heaven and joining the struggle here on earth, being born into a brown-skinned, Palestinian, Jewish, refugee body. All the way to the point of being condemned to die, executed on the cross. Coming from a neighborhood where people said nothing good could come. That's why when, in Philly, folks call Kensington, my neighborhood, they often call it the Badlands. And I always push back on that and say, you better be careful if we call a place the Badlands, because that's exactly what they called Nazareth. And look who showed up. God shows up and still shows up. And so I see the struggle in my neighborhood, but I also see God every single day. I see God in the hope and joy and faith of my neighbors, this resilience and this sense of community. And so I know better than to think that any place should be called the Badlands. But I also know that this whole story is about a God who is leaning into the suffering, right? And yet the gravity is of everything in our culture is kind of pulling us away from the suffering, away from neighborhoods where there's high crime or there's people who don't look like us. And yet the gravity of the gospel pulls us towards the pain. And I'm still, figuring all this out myself. But I know that living near to those who are impacted by injustice and violence and racism and inequity is a really important piece of what it means to follow after Jesus. And it also creates that fire in your bones. I'll never forget one night we heard the gunshots and came outside and this young man had fallen in front of my house and he had been hit. He was still alive, he was breathing, and so I was holding his hand, I was praying with him, the ambulance came, and we found out the next morning he didn't make it. He was 19 years old and his name was Papito. And when Papito was killed, we have a lot of names, in memory of the people lost on our corners. But when he died, I can remember hearing the words of Dr. King, who I love. And Dr. King said, we're all called to be the Good Samaritan and lift our neighbor out of the ditch on the road to Jericho. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you eventually start to say, we need to do something about the whole road to Jericho. Right, we need to do something about what's landing people in the ditch to begin with. And I know we got a lot of Episcopals here tonight, but I come from a little charismatic background, so I'm going to ask you to, everybody's got a, like, Pentecostal deep down somewhere. So, like, you can dig and find a little bit of that. But I am convinced that part of what we got to do is reimagine our streets, right? Reimagine our country to say, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to settle for a country where we're losing 110 souls a day, 110 lives a day to guns. In my lifetime, we've lost more lives to gun violence domestically in America than in all of the casualties of all of America's wars combined. And so that season when Papito was killed, it was Lent. And as we approached Easter, we did things differently. We decided, instead of doing the usual liturgy, and the Lenten services, we wanted to take our liturgy into the streets. And I'll never forget, we did the Stations of the Cross on the corners where people had lost their lives. And on Good Friday, we had the young men in my neighborhood carry the cross to one of the most notorious gun shops in Philadelphia, the Shooter Shop. One of those gun shops that is responsible for a disproportionate amount of the guns that end up being used in crimes. And we know the statistics of the Shooter Shop. And so we gathered to grieve, the lives lost in front of the Shooter Shop. But we carried the cross and we read the gospel, right? We read the story of Jesus' death and the women weeping at the foot of the cross. And then we felt moved after the gospel reading to invite the moms and dads who had lost their kids to come up, and they shared their stories one after another, and there was something that happened, right? Where it was like the tears of those women 2,000 years ago met the tears of our mothers in Kensington, where the gospel that is good news to the poor and liberation for the oppressed was good news to us, and we heard it, in so many different ways. And afterwards, there was this woman, and she was weeping. And I was holding her. She said, I get it. And I said, what? And she said, God knows what it feels like to be me. It was Papito's mother, the mother of the 19-year-old. God knows what it feels like to be me, to see God's own child violently killed. And I think that's one of the most powerful theological statements. It's better than anything I heard in seminary. No offense, Princeton, but that God knows what it feels like to suffer. As Oscar Romero, the great Archbishop of El Salvador, said, "Some truth can only be seen through eyes that have cried." And so that's why I think one of our challenges, especially when it comes to what it means to be the church in the world, is not just a theological challenge. It's a proximity challenge, right? It's being present where Jesus is present in the pain. And I'm convinced that we are losing young people in the church, not because we made the gospel too hard, but because we've made the gospel too easy. Because we have reduced the faith to a doctrinal statement when Jesus wants to sign people up for a revolution. That's where you can say amen if you're feeling the Pentecostal. I'm convinced that our challenge is not just right believing, but right living, right? Translating our faith into something that looks like good news. And there's so many different pieces of this. As we're figuring this out in Philadelphia, when September 11th happened, this was one of those moments, as you know, where it shook us. It shook our country. And people were trying to find ways to express their grief and their fear and their anger over that terrible act of hatred that took so many lives. And I can remember one of the things that happened in Philadelphia. Someone hung a banner that said, "Let's kill them all and let God sort them out." So there were those ugly expressions, right? Those things that look so unlike Jesus, but it's people trying to figure out what to do with their anger and their pain, right? And yet there was another story that captured my attention, and it was the folks who lost their immediate loved ones in September 11th. And you may remember this group. In D.C. and New York, they lost their husbands, wives, mothers, children, and they got together to grieve. And as they began to see the response of the war, their grief became a plea for peace. And they became known as the Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And they said, "Our grief is not a cry for war. Please don't kill in the name of our loved ones. More violence will not heal the wounds of the hatred and violence." And they went on delegations to Iraq and Afghanistan. And eventually I was invited on a similar delegation by a friend of mine who called and said, "There's a group of us that are going to Iraq." And this was exactly 20 years ago, in March of 2003. And if you remember, it was also the season of Lent, right, that I was in Iraq. And if you remember, that was when the bombing and the shock and awe campaign began. There were 900 bombs a day being dropped in Iraq. The most aggressive bombing campaign in history. And we were there. We lived in Baghdad as the bombs were falling. And it's hard to express, all of the things that we saw. We were in a public market that was hit with the bombs. We were in a hospital that a bomb fell on the children's ward of the hospital. A bomb dropped by the United States, right? That we were in a shelter that was filled with women and children, the Amaria shelter. They wouldn't even allow men in the shelter because they wanted to make sure that the kids and the mothers were safe. And the U.S. dropped 2 smart bombs on that shelter, and it incinerated everyone. And now, as we look back, especially a new generation, I talk to young people all the time, and they weren't even alive on September 11th, right? And so you have to explain a few things, like what a payphone is, and what, September 11th, because you look back, and we now know that almost all the folks who hijacked the planes were from Saudi Arabia, but we begin to declare war on Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're still selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. Like a new generation is scratching its head, right? Going, what's going on here? And we look at what happened now in retrospect and know how wrong it was. But I got to tell you, when we were there, I learned so much. Where you sit determines what you see, right? And when we were in Iraq, I'm seeing a whole nother side of this, right? Where I can remember one of my most powerful experiences in Iraq was right as the bombs started falling. We had a service praying for peace, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Christians from all over Iraq that had gotten together, and they read a statement that the bishops had written, and it was addressed to Muslims, and it said, "We want you to know that we love you, and we don't believe that violence is the answer right now." And they pointed to the cross, and these bishops said, "This cross makes no sense to the wisdom of the world, to the smarts of smart bombs, but it's the cross that teaches us the narrow way that leads to life." And then they started singing Amazing Grace in Arabic. It was one of the most powerful services I've ever been in. And I got my charismatic thing going, so I'm like, I run up afterwards and I'm talking 100 miles an hour to the bishop. And I said, "Bishop, this is one of the most powerful services I've ever seen, And I said, "I had no idea there were so many Christians in Iraq." And the bishop goes, yes, this is where Christianity started. And then listen to this. He goes, that's the Tigris River and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them? And he goes, Jonah is buried right around the corner. The Garden of Eden's right down the street, right? And he goes, you didn't invent Christianity in America. You just domesticated it. And we are concerned about why the church in America is not a prophetic conscience in the midst of this war. Why are Christians so often baptizing the bombs instead of standing in front of the bombers? Where is that voice of conscience? And he said, you go back. This is the Iraqi bishop, right? He said, you go back and you tell the church in America that we are praying for them to remember who they are. On the way home, I remember again hearing, thinking of the words of Dr. King, who said, it's amazing, they said this, over 50 years ago, but he said, these are extreme times that we're living in. And the question isn't whether or not we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hatred or extremists for love? And I think you would say it all the more today. We've seen extremists of all different faiths, right? We've seen Christians who do terrible violence, and no one kills with the passion with which someone kills when they believe that God is on their side. And so we're not exempt. But I am so excited to be alive because I believe that these extreme times are an invitation to extreme love. That there is a generation that is ready to challenge evil without mirroring the evil. And one of the questions is, what role will the church play? Right? Where will we be? Will we be in the streets declaring that Black Lives Matter? Will we be standing in the way of violence and war? And I love Walter Brueggemann. My friend Don Golden and I were talking about Walter Brueggemann's wonderful work, The Prophetic Imagination, right? Maybe you've read that. And he wrote this book, The Prophetic Imagination. And in it, Walter says, we often misunderstand the prophets, right? We sometimes think that the prophets were fortune tellers, that they're trying to predict the future. And he says that's not it. The prophets were not fortune tellers, they were truth tellers. And they were not trying to predict the future, they were trying to change it by waking us up to the present and inviting us to imagine a different future from the one where we are headed to right now. And that's why, as we got inspired by this idea of the prophetic imagination, we look at the prophets Micah and Isaiah, and they both tell of a future where we will beat our swords into plows and our spears into pruning hooks. And it's that vision which inspired us to take it literally, right? I mean, I grew up with a different version of fundamentalism. Now I'm just asking, what does it really look like to take Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount seriously? What does it look like to say, if this is really what God's up to in the world, transforming the tools of death into tools of life, how does it change the way that we live? And so about 10 years ago, we said, well, we don't have a lot of swords in America, but we've got more guns than people. And maybe we could transform some of them, right? So I teamed up with my friend Ben Cohen from Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream. He's a good friend to have for many reasons. And my favorite reason is the fudge brownie. But he and I teamed up, and we did this event called Jesus Bombs and Ice Cream. And we had a AK-47. That was our first donated gun. And we transformed it into a shovel and a rake. And we ended the night by dropping buckets of Ben & Jerry's ice cream from helium balloons. It was a magical night. Don't expect that tonight. I didn't bring any Ben & Jerry. But and there was something that was so powerful as we watched this live transformation of a weapon, and we kept doing it. So over the years, as some of you may know, we've kept getting guns off the streets and transforming them. And I brought a few things. I'm finding that these days there's a lot of flat Zoom calls and virtual stuff, and so I like physical things. And so I brought a few symbols with me tonight. And this is actually the first hand tool that we made. It's got the number 1 on the bottom. This was a gun that we found in an abandoned house in Philly. It's part of the problem, right? We found this gun, a handgun, in one of the abandoned buildings. And so we turned it into this hand tool, this plow. But as we were doing it, we felt compelled to invite anybody that wanted to take the hammer. And this one mother, with a picture of her little boy on her shirt, Miss Rhines, she told the story of how her son was killed in Philadelphia from a stray bullet, a random shooting. And she began beating on this tool right here. And she said, with every thump of the hammer, she said, "This is for my boy." And it felt like she wasn't just transforming a piece of metal, but she was participating in that holy work of transforming the world, right? This idea that we will beat our swords into plows. I'm going to pass that around, and you can hold it. And over the years, we've done a lot of weapons transformations. We like to say that you can tell our work has gotten a little bit sharper and better as we do it. But this is now this handle is made from the wood stock of a gun, and that's a tool that my wife and I made. And this is a shovel that we made that I'll pass these around. And as you hold them, I think that it's powerful to see the possibility, right? And I mean, to say all things can be made new. I mean, what I tell my evangelical friends is, this is what a gun looks like when it gets born again. And, just as metal can be transformed, so can the human heart. And so can our communities. So can our country. It doesn't have to be this way. All things can be made new. Our latest thing that we've been learning, we did this today, is we've been picking up the bullet casings. And we actually have a little trash bin at the front door of our community center. And people can pick these up. And sadly, our streets are riddled with way too many brass bullet casings. This is off of my block. And we're able to melt those down and make hearts like that one. So this is made from the melting down of bullets, many of which are off of our blocks. And I say all of that because I think what we need is not just more talk and more theology, but we need to be able to show something of what it means to be God's people, to be followers of Jesus. And in the end, I think if our faith is not good news to the poor, if it is not freedom for the oppressed, it is not the gospel of Jesus, right? Because the gospel says that God is casting the mighty from their thrones and lifting up the lowly. God's filling the hungry with good things and sending the rich home empty. I always tell my friends, that's not Karl Marx. That's the gospel of Luke. That's the song of Mary, right? That's the gospel is about the last becoming first, the first becoming last, the peacemakers are the children of God. The gospel is a contradiction of so many of the patterns of this world. And that's why I love it when Dr. King says, they called him maladjusted, Dr. King. And he said, at first I was a little disturbed to be called maladjusted, but then I realized how we've become way too adjusted to injustice. We've become way too adjusted to racism. We've become way too adjusted to other people's suffering. We need some holy, maladjusted people in the world today. And so I want to say that may very well be our calling as the people of God, is not to conform to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed, to live with new imagination, to live into a story that is all about transforming the world from what it is into what God wants it to be. Amen? Amen. Well, I promised I was not going to talk too long, but I was going to leave some time for dialogue, so I think that's why we have a microphone. And I am absolutely thrilled and honored to be a part of the Lenten series here, and I hope you're ready for a little bit of conversation, because we've got plenty of time, and I'm going to be hanging out in the back too. I've got all kinds of stuff that we made out of chopped up guns back there if you want to see it. And I look forward to making some new friends tonight. But first, let's open it up for dialogue if anyone wants to share.
So I'm interested in where your place is and your neighborhood. And I want you to tell us more about that.
Yeah, cool.
Because we know a little bit about Philadelphia. Thank you.
Yeah, cool, great. So we are at Kensington and Allegheny. It's the north side of Philly, Kensington, which is a neighborhood where everybody wanted to move. It's why American Street went right through it. It was the pride of Philadelphia. And then over the last 50, 60 years, we've lost over 100,000 jobs. And we've got 700 abandoned factories. We've got 30,000 abandoned houses. And that's why I say, if you believe in resurrection, this is a great place to live, because we get to practice it every day. And so part of what we're doing right now is we're getting abandoned houses and we're turning them into beautiful homes for families that get to own their first home. So we get houses often for $1, and they need some work. So we fix them up, and we don't sell any of our houses right now for more than $35,000, and we do it at no interest. So that all of the payments are going directly to pay off the house. So we're doing 6 houses right now. And if anybody knows construction, come on up. Or if you got a little money, you want to sponsor a house, let me know. But we've got folks that are all pitching in different ways, and we're fixing these houses up. We're very holistic and comprehensive in what we do. So we're doing community gardens, we're painting murals, we've got our tool shop, our Guns to Plow shop, and we are celebrating our 25th year in Kensington.
Thank you very much for telling us this part of your story. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your actual theological journey of ordination. What led you there? Where you were? You said Princeton. Just kind of how you have evolved, and what are you part of a church? Just kind of a little bit about the theology side, even though you've created what sounds like a much bigger theology.
So I grew up Methodist. I grew up United Methodist, and I felt well loved in the Methodist church, but also, to be honest, I got a little bit bored. And that's where I joined the Pentecostals, because I felt like it seemed like they believed in a God that was active and wild, and they believed in miracles. You know, I had to get rebaptized because the sprinkling didn't count. You got to go all the way under, and that had bones that I needed to spit out, but it also really shaped me, and I still embrace a lot of that. I leaned into the historic black church in Philadelphia. We've got Mother Bethel AME. We've got some of the oldest historic black churches in Quakers and all kinds of other, it's a lot of old faith there. And I really, really leaned into some Anabaptist theology. So we wrote a book called Jesus for President, where folks that are now dear friends like Stanley Hauerwas and others were shaping our theology. We come out of the great tradition of the Catholic worker movement. We're often called the Protestant Catholic worker because we share some of those same roots of Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. So that's all a little bit of my theology. I didn't grow up in the Peace Church. My dad was in Vietnam. My family are still, most of them, gun owners. And yet they're also gun owners that are increasingly deeply concerned about gun violence. So we find a lot of common ground, even though they still need to have a shotgun to keep the coyotes from eating the baby calves and whatnot. But, that's a little bit of, I guess, my theology. Certainly the Catholic Church helped deepen and inform a lot of who I am. Mother Teresa and my mentors have been largely Catholic over the last 10 years. Friends like Richard Rohr that are really dear friends that have we've done a lot of stuff together over the years. So those are folks that have shaped me, and there's still a few bones to spit out. I'm not Catholic, but I am Catholic friendly. Episcopalians like that joke, but I love, there's so much going on in the Episcopal Church that I'm a part of. I just was saying I was with your presiding bishop, Michael, just a few weeks ago. We have a great time together. I think there's a lot of beautiful things happening in the Episcopal Church. If you are looking for another excuse to come to Philly, there's a couple of things happening during Lent at the Philadelphia Cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral. And one of them is my really close friends who are on death row in Tennessee. So these are all men that have been sentenced to execution and the death penalty. They painted the Stations of the Cross, and it's unbelievable, the power. You can see it online too at Red Letter Christians, but they're on display at the Episcopal Cathedral. And we're doing another thing together too on April 4th, which is the anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. We're having a service at the Philadelphia Cathedral. And at 7:01, when Dr. King was killed, we will have a gun that is very similar to the gun that killed Dr. King, and we'll beat on it 55 times, once for each year since his death, and the bells of the cathedral will toll with the beating of that gun, and we'll have readings from Dr. King. So if you're looking for a little road trip, April 4th, we'll be at the Philadelphia Episcopal Cathedral. So, yeah, anybody else? I think we got a few minutes left, and then I'll hang out in the back and talk with any of you. Yeah, come on up. Yeah, cool. Thanks. I realize I have your microphone. So, yeah, but the personal practices, spiritual practices that inform our work, there's a lot of them. One of the things that we did about 10 years into the community that I'm a part of is we realized that we were maybe better activists than we were prayers. And so we wanted to find a way to pray together that felt authentic and felt real. And we had Catholics and Pentecostals and Episcopalians and all together trying to pray. And so we came up with a prayer book called Common Prayer. You might have heard, it's different from the Book of Common Prayer, but I took a copy of it to Justin Welby, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? And he showed me the desk where the Book of Common Prayer was written, and he's like, "This is awesome," And so he's got our book, but we were obviously winking at the fact that this is an ongoing liturgical story. And so what we did though was we put the liturgy of the church with history. As Karl Barth said, we need to read the Bible in one hand, but we need to hold the newspaper in the other. And so every day we're waking up and we're remembering, in fact, this month, that when Oscar Romero was killed as he served Mass. We're remembering Fannie Lou Hamer and Harriet Tubman. We're remembering when Mandela was released from prison. We're remembering when we dropped the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb. We're remembering the worst parts of history and the most beautiful and courageous parts of it. And that's how we pray. It's also got songs in it. So we've got, I think, 50 different songs that include spirituals and freedom songs and hymns. The only thing we don't have much of are contemporary worship songs because the copyrights cost so much. I was telling my friend, it's all these Christian singers, they're like, God gave me this song, but if you want to sing it, you got to pay royalties, and so we couldn't afford. We have like $30,000 of copyrights already in the song, and we don't even have any contemporary songs. But we've got a lot of really beautiful old songs, Taizé songs, Benedictine songs. So there's 50 songs in it. But every month there's a practice, and this is what made me think. There's something that we do to cultivate our practices of our faith, not just our prayer life, but what does it look like in practice. We also found as we were compiling Common Prayer that there are over 35,000 denominations. 35,000. And yet Jesus' longest prayer is that we would be one as God is one. So that's what we're going for. So there's a few copies of it back there. I'm still I really appreciate the liturgy. I think it needs to be dusted off a little bit. That's why I like doing Stations of the Cross, in the streets. But or having the Stations of the Cross painted by men on death row, right? It's taking the old, but also bringing something fresh to the liturgy. So for Lent, one of the things that Katie and I do is we try to unplug, and so we use oil lamps. We don't use electrical lighting. And we go Amish, for the season of Lent. And it's so good for our soul. And a lot of the prayers in the midday prayer, there's a prayer for the middle of the day. Those came from India. So Mother Teresa, every day, this is just one of the prayers that Mother Teresa would pray every day. May every person I come in contact with feel your presence in my soul, Jesus. May I leave off your fragrance everywhere I go, Jesus. So it's that prayer that we would be able to say with Paul, the life I live, I no longer live, but Jesus lives in me. So a way of praying that is about ourselves being transformed so that we are a vehicle of God's love and grace. Those are a few. Yeah, maybe one more, won't you? And I'll go hang out. Yeah.
I'm a little confused, and you're saying, do you live in community? Is there a whole group of you who live together? And I'm not sure.
Yeah, so like the Catholic worker movement, right, started houses of hospitality where folks live together and share resources. So our community started as an intentional community house where 6 of us moved in together we pulled our money together. Our inspiration was the early church. right, where it says no one claimed any of their money was their own or any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. There were no needy persons among them. They worshiped God in their homes, so it was the opposite of the mega church. It was the micro church. You know, the gospel is lived out of living rooms and dinner tables. So that is how we started. And then we grew from an intentional community into more of a village. And now we've got, 15 or 20 properties that are all in the same neighborhood. We think of our community as a village, and the language that we're able to use is that it's remainers, returners, and relocators. And that's language of one of my mentors, John Perkins. And he says, restoring a neighborhood takes remainers, indigenous neighbors, folks that have lived in my neighborhood longer than me. Some of their parents and grandparents worked in the factories, and those are the remainers. Returners, people that grew up in Kensington, but they don't forget where they came from. And as they acquire skills and stuff, they bring those back to the neighborhood. And then that's the returners, and then relocators, folks like me that move in with the right posture, to listen and learn and build on the ideas of the neighborhood. And so I'm a relocator. So that's kind of helpful language for how we think of the village at the Simple Way. And the name of our community is The Simple Way. So you can, see us online or come visit, or I'll tell you more about it out back. But let me close this by, I was thinking of, in this new book that I just finished, Rethinking Life, one of the memories I have of being in Iraq is when we were in the middle of the bombing, there was such courage from the children. And I picked up this is a piece of one of the bombs that our country and coalition troops, they dropped on Baghdad. And when there was one day where this little girl named Amal was turning 13. And I kind of tell this story a little bit more fully in the book, but she was turning 13 years old. And we thought, you got to have a birthday party, So it didn't matter that it was a war. We decided to have a birthday party, and we did it to the max. We had all birthday cake, all kinds of games, this banquet feast of a meal, and we're throwing Amal a birthday, and then the bombs started falling, and everything is shaking. And all the adults are like, we better get inside, and the kids refused to go. And they said, we've got to keep the party going. And they started yelling at the airplanes. These are U.S. planes, right? Flying over, dropping the bombs. They said, Salam! Salam! Peace, peace. And I'll never forget as we asked Amal what she wanted for her 13th birthday as she blew out the candles. And she said, I want peace. But then with the beautiful smirk of a 13-year-old, she goes, but if one night when no one was in my school, if one of the bombs blew it up, that'd be kind of cool too. And as those kids, they showed me faith and hope and courage. And as we were in Iraq, my friend heard some of the kids singing and recognized the song, right, and grabbed a recorder. And so that's what I want to close this with is these are kids 20 years ago in Iraq singing not just any song, but We Shall Overcome. So let me play that for you.
نحن نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم
join in.
We shall overcome someday.
May it be so. Amen. I'll be hanging out in the back. I hope to meet all of you.